Well, before you guys get mad, just watch the video. I'll admit it is a little clickbaity. Just watch the video, hear what I have to say, and then go on the comments and type in your angry comments, all right? Like that's totally fine. I just don't want you. I know the title suggests you get on your computers and start angrily typing, okay? Just don't do that. Just sit down for a second, listen to what I'm going to say, and then type your comments. That's, just do that, okay? Can you do that for me? All right, doing good. Hello, everyone. Britton here, also known as Some Okie Dude, and I am back with another video where I'm reviewing a book. So, the book I'm going on today is, of course, a unjustly forgotten fantasy classic, at least according to some people, and I might dare say I agree. And that is The Broken Sword by Mr. Poul Anderson. We even have a nice little blurb by Michael Moorcock where he says it is one of the most influential fantasy novels I have ever read. And yeah, I wanted to read The Broken Sword for a long time. Finally did it, so I have some thoughts on it. Let's get into it. In 1954, two great fantasy novels would come out. One would go on to change the landscape of the fantasy genre and has proven an influential classic, while the other has been somewhat forgotten by the ravages of time and has gone on to become a cult classic of sorts. Yes, The Broken Sword came out the same year as J.R.R. Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring, the first of his legendary Lord of the Rings trilogy. I kind of have to bring it up since it's become a selling point for this specific book in general. For many, Tolkien's is the greater fantasy, but there are certain fantasy aficionados, such as the aforementioned Michael Moorcock, who claim that The Broken Sword is not only a forgotten classic, but even better than Tolkien's masterpiece. Blasphemy, dare I say. But could he be right? Often I take Moorcock's jabs at Tolkien with a grain of salt. I mean, the guy can't seem to go 5 minutes without taking a pot shot at the old professor. I was skeptical, for sure, but also very intrigued. Skeptical because many fantasy authors of Poul Anderson's era and generation were content to rip off the great pulp fantasist Robert E. Howard. Well, if they weren't ripping off Tolkien, that is. I feared that Anderson might do the same. But I was also intrigued, however, because I was curious to see how someone else would fare taking from similar sources as Tolkien did. The Broken Sword is very much inspired by a lot of Norse and English mythology, and as is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, of course. But my skepticism soon eroded as I was won over by Anderson's much more mystical, lyrical approach. The Broken Sword is a tragic and often curious blend of Norse myth, sword and sorcery, and English fairy tales. There is certainly some influence from Robert E. Howard here, and the novel starts off as a riff on the sword and sorcery tradition of fantasy, with action and Howardian melodrama to spare. But it becomes clear as this book moves along that Anderson is no mere imitator. He understands why Howard works, yet he adds the Howardian influence into his own style that he's created here, tweaking it and making it into his own. The language, however, is much more mythical in tone, likely inspired by the Norse sagas he was emulating, as I mentioned before. The language in this book is on fire. I mean, it moves, it courses through you, and enraptures you into its spell. I was particularly entranced by Anderson's skilled use of alliteration and poetry, which reminded me a lot of Philip Chase's own take on poetry in the Adan series at points. Though I have asked him, he has not read this specific book yet, though he has heard of it, so take that with what you will. Though, again, they were taking from similar sources, so I wouldn't be shocked if there was some overlap there. So don't think that Philip ripped off this book or anything. I'm not trying to explain that. Not trying to say that, sorry. Yeah, what was most surprising to me is how effortlessly it skirts between sword and sorcery and the English fairy tale style. Not only do gods and men fight it out in this book, but we also see elves at play here. Though they're not quite the wise sages of Tolkien's legendarium, they're more like the fairies you would find in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Alien, callous, completely uninterested in human concerns, and often using people like their playthings. Now, before the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell fans get excited, I am not saying that there are gentlemen magicians in this trying to figure out how magic works. Unfortunately, that is not the case. This is more of a sword and sorcery novel, but it does have that similar mystical, lyrical approach that Susanna Clarke played with in her own great work of fantasy. But these beings are not necessarily evil. They just operate on a completely different set of morals than regular people like you or I. The Norse gods in this book also indulge in this and are very little better at this, using people like their chess pieces and forgetting that people are made in their image and are sentient beings who can make choices and have emotions and all that fun stuff. But also surprising in this book were the characters and how their journeys complement the themes of this story, particularly with Skaflock's story and his doomed romance with Freda. Their dalliance is at the core of the book's thematic exploration of cultural incomprehensibility and the inevitable conflict between the old pagan morality and the burgeoning Christian morality. The twist regarding Skaflock and Freda's romance is hardly a twist at all. It's more like a sick joke that's played on them by the gods and elves. The irony is played for magnificent effect here, as they learn who they truly are and the fact that despite their budding love, they have no choice regarding their lives and they have no chance to stay together. Unfortunately, though, it is the characters where I find the book has its fatal flaw. I do wish that Anderson had drawn out some of the characters' personalities and struggles, making the tragedy really soar with pathos. He doesn't really delve enough into the characters to make them fully empathetic people, and there were big emotional moments in this book that didn't quite land for me. And while I found these characters were interesting on a thematic level, and Anderson really extends those themes to their logical conclusion, there wasn't really enough for me to empathize, to feel the tragedy that Anderson was playing at here. We see this particularly with Valgard, who is a character who should be at the core of this tragic story. A being who didn't have a single choice or say in his life, used and discarded by beings who are above his station, beings he can barely come to comprehend. Sadly, the tragic moments that Anderson intended didn't land as well as they certainly could have. Like with Skaflock and Freda, if Valgard had been given some more internality, I think the tragedy would have been even more poignant. But then again, I am speaking from a 21st century perspective. This was written in 1954, so maybe it was different back then. And that's totally fine. I'm not saying that's, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just, times have changed. I'm not saying that I expect some Abercrombie levels of character development here, but it would have been nice to have a little more internality. It would have been quite nice, indeed. I can't say I'm shocked that Michael Moorcock calls The Broken Sword the most influential fantasy novel he's ever read, or one of the most, I should say, because a lot of the ideas he would go on to use in the Elric saga originated here. The titular broken sword that drives you insane with bloodlust, dark decadent elves, the melancholic brooding atmosphere and characters, people being playthings in a cosmic battle and between cosmic beings that can't be understood or comprehended, the whole 9 yards. Yet while Moorcock plays with these themes with a postmodern wink, if you will, Anderson is much more sincere and contemplative with these themes. He was attempting to tell a modern Norse saga with this book. In some of his later books as well, he attempted to do this as well. But with this book, I can also see the underpinnings of what would later become grimdark come into play here, with the brooding, conflicted characters, grim tone, and often very bleak outcomes for the characters. I mean, everything that Abercrombie and John Gwynne and Mark Lawrence have done kind of lends itself to this, kind of started here, is really where it pulls back from, rather they know it or not. But the question remains, however, is this book any better than Lord of the Rings? No, not even close. Now, I won't be obtuse and pretend I can't see where the two can be compared. I mean, both were inspired by Norse sagas and both played with the idea of creating a new English myth in their respective works. But with that said, they're doing completely different things here. Tolkien is generally more romantic in his worldview, while Anderson has a more fatalistic, ironic view that you see throughout The Broken Sword that feels much truer to the original Norse myths that they were both pulling from. Though I wouldn't call Tolkien's story a Norse kind of story. This is a Norse kind of story, with the existential angst and gods playing against each other, fate, all that fun stuff. There is tragedy and loss in Tolkien's world. I get that. I'm not, completely, I'm not a complete dummy. And he does acknowledge that you can't defeat evil for good, even if you can stop it for a while. But he believes that people's better natures will prevail. Anderson is not interested in such things. In his world, you can't fight fate and you can't fight your weird. Capturing the bleak and often hopeless nature of Norse myth and lore that enraptures so many, including myself. Moorcock does bring up a good point, though. What if it was this book that became the fantasy classic, and Tolkien's never really took off the way it did in our world? Would much of our fantasy look like Anderson's vision that he demonstrated here? Or will we get more books like Strange and Norrell, Baz Lag, The Vor, or the Dark Star trilogy? Perhaps we'd even have alternate Moorcocks running around, proclaiming that Tolkien is the underrated classic that everyone should read. I am unsure, personally. I would chide Moorcock for comparing this book to Tolkien, because that wouldn't necessarily be true. But if that's the way to get people to read this book, I can't really begrudge his tactics in doing so. And I think this book is absolutely, really quite good, though. I think it's a very strong fantasy novel, and a good one to read if you are wanting a bit of a palate cleanser from the epics that we are so accustomed to in the world of fantasy. But yeah, that's all I have for now about The Broken Sword. Yeah, that was tough. Let me get a drink. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. You can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on Goodreads and Letterboxd, where I write reviews that are probably more coherent than the one you just heard right now. You can also find me on Instagram and Blue Sky. Don't use Blue Sky very much, but I'm starting to use it a little bit more. That's about it in terms of social media and everything that I use. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, see you guys later. Bye-bye.